Yes, I'm back. I was gone for a while again, but this time I have a reason. I had to take a little trip and I was forced into isolation for 2 weeks. This is how I actually looked like when I went out. Now, the only thing I've actually been doing in my personal time by now is mostly writing my book. A lot of you don't know, but I am aspiring to be a writer. I haven't published anything yet, but I hope to do soon, as writing is kind of a hobby of mine. So, just a little spoiler the book I'm currently writing is a thriller that deals with geopolitics. China is an antagonist in the book, and it deals with the modern world once we've dealt with the virus that, starts with this name. But YouTube deletes videos that deal with that topic and have any of those tags. But in the book, China's influence as the world's factory has basically diminished, mostly because of the virus. That is what I want to touch on today. Rita Panahi from Sky News in Australia has criticized China about dominating many economic sectors when it comes to trade with China itself.
This global pandemic has also exposed how dangerously underprepared Australia and the rest of the world is for a catastrophe of this scale, and how dependent we've allowed our countries to become on China for essential medical goods and pharmaceuticals. The world has stood by and watched as China has built a near monopoly on the pharmaceutical supply chain. In Australia, the situation is even worse than it is in the US. A recent report by the Institute for Integrated Economic Research found that we currently import over 90% of medicines, with a key dependency on China. Indeed, the report concluded that Australia is particularly vulnerable to medical shortages arising from factors outside our control. Even the drugs we import from countries other than China are often dependent on supplies from China. As Peter Navarro said earlier this year, China has managed to dominate all aspects of the supply chain using the same unfair trade practices that it has used to dominate other sectors, namely cheap sweatshop labour, lax environmental regulations and massive government subsidies.
It's indeed true with the rest of the world. Many everyday things you use in everyday life is made in China, and so the Chinese hold a very big piece of that industry. Many companies are not willing to shift to a more expensive labor workforce, but that also goes with the commodities we sell to them. The lives of Chinese people in urban areas has vastly improved since the time of Mao Zedong, and because of that, they are able to buy Western products. But as Panahi explained, China is basically an authoritarian government that hates free speech. In order to sell products to the Chinese people and make a lot of money, they need to appease the Chinese Communist Party. Last year, for example, Apple was forced to take down an app that protesters were using to track the police in order to placate the Chinese government. This even goes into entertainment, which is why I made this video earlier. I personally like a kind of World War III scenario in a movie, and I'm more likely to find one that shows China as an antagonist on Netflix or HBO than in Hollywood, since a lot of their production studios wants to scratch China's back in order to be shown in Chinese cinemas.
Come on, guys. Everyone else is fine with China approving our entertainment.
Fortunately, people are becoming aware of this problem, especially when it comes to being supplied medical equipment from China. That is something important at this time. So that also begs the question, how to solve it? Many alt-right activists would say to bring all manufacturing jobs back to the West, that protectionism is needed. That is not a good idea. If all basic stuff were created in North America or Europe, all goods would be much more expensive, and the average person might not be able to afford all of them. And trade with other countries would then be blocked, as companies won't be willing to pay the high import charges. There's another way to take down China's influence, and that way is to use a word that many people despise. We need to diversify our manufacturing sector. Think about it. A very large portion of Western products are made in China, and I mean a lot. That's because they have a lot of people who can take part in low-skilled labor, and very cheaply. But it is not the only nation where goods are manufactured. Vietnam is a country with 96 million people, a large number of which are low-skilled workers who work in manufacturing. Yep, Vietnam manufactures a lot of things that we use, especially sneakers. Although it is growing, manufacturing in Vietnam takes up only a fraction of what it should be. In 2007, manufacturing accounted for only 24% of the country's industrial input and employed only 12.9% of the workforce. One possibility to lower China's influence is to shift one portion of China's manufacturing to Vietnam. And the same thing can be done, sending portions of China's manufacturing to other Southeast Asian countries where low-skilled labor is abundant. The manufacturing jobs could also be shifted to Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, and many others. Southeast Asia altogether has a population of 655 million people. That can take a huge chunk out of China's workforce when spread across all those nations. And it could also be spread further. Bangladesh and Nepal could also receive manufacturing jobs that can be taken out of China. Here's one example of a way that we've already done. Does anyone know what the most dangerous job in the world is? It's shipbreaking. Now, this video will be too long if I go into what shipbreaking is, and I would go completely off topic, so you can check out some documentaries about that profession. But the shipbreaking industry is spread out across multiple countries, such as India, Bangladesh, China, Pakistan, and Turkey. That is the kind of model that we need for our manufacturing sector. A lot of Chinese people will then lose jobs, they won't be able to afford as much Western commodities as our companies, and they won't be keen on appeasing the Chinese government. Australia and Japan, countries who pretty much trade a lot with China, could also benefit from that as well. So why hasn't this already been done? Well, two reasons, both of which have to do with money. It is expensive to move a business elsewhere, and people aren't willing to do so unless they're sure it will be successful. But now we have the chance. Last month, trade with China plummeted by 17%, and it could drop more. We could use that opportunity to send manufacturing jobs to other nations when this isolation period ends and when we're ready to trade again, because we'll anyway have to spend money going back in. So we might as well just send a large portion to Southeast Asia and other nations in Central Asia. The second reason is labor costs. At the moment, companies are relatively short-sighted. They only moved manufacturing to China because they can afford to pay their workforce less than India or many Southeast Asian nations. But it is clear that in the long run, this is not a cheaper solution. When China got the virus, all of that trading brought it right to our doorstep. Currently, the virus could cost the US $90 billion, and it is already costing the European Union 37 billion euros. Let's not forget that according to the UN, this pandemic could also cost the global economy $2 trillion this year alone. Are you seriously going to tell me that's cheaper than a labor force in Southeast Asia? And even if the world wasn't plagued by this pandemic, we would still have to consider withdrawing manufacturing jobs from China. The Chinese population is disproportionately old and its birth rate is low. It's even lower than North America or Europe. In a few years, their workforce number will reach a peak and then begin a sharp decline. This will lead to higher wages and they won't be able to make goods as cheaply. That's something that'll be less attractive to investors. Diversifying our manufacturing sector is the cheapest and most efficient way out there. But giving a larger range of nations fractions of our manufacturing sector, everyone would benefit. Except for China, of course. It would improve the lives of people in impoverished regions of Southeast Asia, while forbidding the exponential rise of a certain nation like that of China, because each nation would only control a certain fraction of the manufacturing sector. And most importantly, it would prohibit any large influence or any of those nations to have over the West the way China does right now.
Dependence on China would be a grave concern, even if it was an open democratic nation which shared our values. But as we know, it is nothing of the sort. The Chinese Communist government is a totalitarian regime that brutalises its own citizens and is an enduring threat to the rest of the world. It's time we treated it as such instead of turning a blind eye to its conduct and human rights abuses because of what seems like economic convenience. Once we are through this global catastrophe, we must ensure that we never again become so reliant on a destructive communist regime for essential medicines and medical equipment.